Hey everybody, welcome to Exploring Reality. I'm really excited today because we got Liz Jackson on here. And we're going to be talking about like faith, epistemology, and all sorts of really fun stuff here. Um, so yeah, Liz, you've never been on the channel before. I've been wanting to have you on for a while. For those that don't know who you are, why don't you kind of just introduce who you are, what you're about? Start with the human sides before we go to the scholarly stuff. And yeah.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, first of all, just thanks so much for having me on. I'm super pumped to, chat about these things today and to be on this channel. So that's great. Yeah, like human side. I'm married. I have a 6-month-old. We live in Toronto, actually almost 7-month-old. It's crazy how when you're counting months, it just goes by so fast.
Yeah.
So he'll be 7 months in 6 days. So
Wow.
so yeah, new parent, which has been exciting and challenging, but really good too. You've been through all that, so we could
Yeah.
probably talk about parenting for like an hour and all the changes that come with that. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a lot of fun. And I got like 6 months off, which was really nice to kind of like adjust everything and figure out sleeping, which is such a big thing. So
Yeah.
anyway, trying to think of I guess like hobbies while we're on the personal thing. I really like sports. I played basketball a ton growing up. Haven't played as much lately, but I'm hoping to get back into it kind of now that,
Yeah.
the birth and stuff is been in
Done
the
with?
distance more. Yeah, exactly. So I like working out. I like cooking, podcasts, going on walks. The city's really great.
Nice.
We live in Toronto. It's an awesome place to go on walks. So we end up you just going on walks a lot, which is
Yeah, I've
great.
been to
In fact,
Toronto before. It's
walking a lot.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. I love living in a place where you don't have to drive all the time. I feel like, it's fine, like Midwest, everyone drives everywhere. Like,
I live
but
in the
it's so
boonies, so
nice to yeah. Totally. So yeah, we've
I
been
didn't
in
know you
Toronto
like
almost
cooking.
a year now.
So
I do
that's
like
cool to
cooking.
know.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
not like a chef, but
it's just
it's
fun
fun.
to
It's kind
cook.
of a
I just made I
de-stressor.
just made I
Yeah.
just made sushi for dinner, if you like sushi.
Nice.
So
Yes, I love sushi. It's actually some
nice.
people ask what's my favorite food, and often I say
Sushi?
sushi, but yeah, it's so good. And so yeah, I actually started it's so expensive though. But really when you buy the ingredients, the only thing that's that expensive is like the smoked salmon or the fish, and it's not even that bad.
Yeah.
So I
It's not even
actually
that bad.
started making my own too.
You can
Experimenting with different
I'll
kinds of
just show
sushi
I'll send you
makers,
some
but
recipes for like shrimp tempura and stuff like that. It's not that expensive to
oh, I
make
haven't
your
done
own
that.
too. Yeah, so
Cool. I would love
yeah,
that.
there's a lot of really cool ways to do it. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Sorry, we
People,
probably got
no. I'm the one who started
too
that.
far on
People didn't show up to
this
listen to
yeah,
sushi talk.
sushi,
Okay.
parenting in Toronto, yeah. Anyway, so maybe I'll say a little bit about, like, professionally who I am.
Yeah,
So,
please.
yeah, I'm a philosopher. I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. So I went from there to actually doing a postdoc in Australia for a year, and then started my job here in Toronto. So I teach at Toronto Metropolitan University, and my teaching and research overlap a good amount. It's a decently big department, so often people will sort of teach in their research areas, and some people might already know this, but for those that don't, my main areas are epistemology and then philosophy of religion. So I was thinking maybe people could like guess from the title possibly that those
Yeah.
are my areas. But yeah, so it's kind of like the study of knowledge and rational belief. Like I kind of think a lot about the question like, what should I believe? Is that something
Yeah.
that should be determined by evidence, other things? How does that all kind of work? And then also philosophy of religion. So most of my research there is kind of on the rationality of religious commitment. And I take
Mhm.
belief to be a kind of commitment, but also, practicing a religion or accepting a religion or converting to a religion. Like, under what conditions are those things rational? So
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested. Epistemology, philosophy, religion, and I guess their intersection is maybe one way to think about it.
Yeah, and I find that topic super interesting. I haven't really landed
Cool.
the plane anywhere, so maybe this talk, maybe our chat here is actually gonna like push me in a
Cool.
direction. But like, so for background, like I'm a Bayesian confirmation theorist, which you know what that is probably.
Absolutely.
And I'm really big into philosophy of science and all that stuff. And so like the question, it
Great.
like there's this like really broad area of where it's really broad, but like what does this mean? and again, this is why I haven't landed the plane. It's like, okay, well, I think it's rational to be a Christian when the probability of Christianity is higher than its negation. But like that's still
Mm,
like that's like it doesn't seem satisfying enough to me. So I'm actually really excited
mm.
about this talk now because of that. So
Yeah, and like there's also just the question of we don't need to go into this, but what be a
yeah,
Christian means is that
yeah,
interpreted as like what you should believe, whether you should practice it or convert to it,
yeah,
and then like if it's not belief, like what all does that involve? You know, because like some things like praying, I feel like atheists can totally pray. That's great.
yeah,
Taking communion, that might be much more controversial. Like maybe that should
yeah,
only be reserved for certain. You know, so like I feel like there's kind of a range of interesting questions there, but
yeah,
excited to jump in. So yeah.
yeah. So so based off what I've like seen in your work before, you make a distinction between credences and
Mhm.
beliefs, right?
Yeah,
So can you help us understand what you mean when you're saying these things, and like maybe even some of the background knowledge that might be important to that like topic?
for sure. And this is actually what I did my dissertation on. So yeah, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And I think it actually is important. Like I don't think it's just a philosopher's thing. I think there's kind of everyday implications for this as well. And we can get into that more. But yeah, basically, when you think about kind of our attitudes, the ways that we kind of represent the world or
Hmm.
kind of respond to evidence, there's basically two kinds of attitudes that we have that you might call epistemic, like related to evidence and truth, maybe.
Yeah.
And the first is belief. And so when it comes to belief, there's really three main attitudes you would take towards a statement or what philosophers call a proposition. So you would believe it, you would withhold belief on it, or you would disbelieve it. So, you know, I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I believe it's 8:11 p.m., at least in my time zone. I
Hmm.
withhold belief that I have like an even number of hairs on my head. I withhold belief that a fair coin will land heads before it's tossed, of course. And then, you know, I disbelieve that, um, you know, I'm trying to think. It's 75 degrees in Antarctica right now. I disbelieve that my son is screaming right now because we would probably hear him. I disbelieve that 1
Yeah.
+ 1 = 3. So just
Yeah.
some examples of kind of there's like and often what's known as traditional epistemology, they'll kind of talk about belief in this way. They'll sort of say, look, you believe it, you withhold on it, you disbelieve it. For every proposition, you take at least one of those attitudes and only one, at least every proposition you've like considered or formed an attitude towards. It's a
Yeah.
common view. Okay. So there's the one hand. The other hand is, well, what are these things credences? Like belief is kind of a familiar word we probably use in, you know, English a lot. We sometimes will say
Yeah.
think, like, you know, I think that's true or something. But you know,
Yeah.
belief is familiar, but credence is a weird word. And the way
Yeah.
I like to explain it, maybe more colloquially, is you can call it like a confidence level. So how confident
Yeah.
are you that something is true? And notice, look, I said I believe I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I forgot my other example, but let's just say I believe it's going to rain tomorrow because there's like a 90% chance of rain on the forecast.
Yeah.
Well, my attitude towards those two statements isn't actually exactly the same because I'm pretty much 100% confident 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, we can
Yeah.
get into some like skepticism stuff, but like very, very close. Whereas
Yeah.
like my confidence level that it will rain tomorrow is, you know, if I'm following the forecast, like about, you know, 90% or zero point 0.9. So oftentimes philosophers will say credence one is 100%
Yeah.
sure, credence zero, 0% sure.
Yeah.
So instead of 1 to 100, it's 0 to 1. It doesn't really matter how you
Right.
measure it, but I'll often do 0 to 1 just because that's how a lot of philosophers think about it. So
Yeah. I found that
yeah,
people I found that and this is and like anything in philosophy, this is kind of somebody might disagree with that. This is
yeah,
like
yeah,
I find the way that colloquially or like on a pop level, getting people to understand like one and zero, the way I kind of like try to say it is, hey, like if you think that like the probability of any proposition is one, you're pretty much just saying it's necessary. It's like it could be something that's necessarily true, or it's logically impossible that it's false.
right.
And I usually just tell people that the same holds for the zero thing. It's just inverse. Would you say that's a
Right.
good way of like popularizing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think. that is definitely a very common way of looking at it. Different
Yeah.
philosophers will kind of like debate about
Yeah.
like what if it's necessary but you don't know it's necessary, like unproven
Yeah.
mathematical theorems like Goldbach's conjecture. So there's, I mean, I think that's definitely a common way of thinking about it, but philosophers will get into the weeds here with little
Yeah.
counterexamples. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's right. At least a common way of thinking
Yeah.
about it. And another way of thinking about it too is just like credence one is like 100% certainty beyond any shadow of a doubt. So it's not just like I'm sure we need the 32 bus or whatever. It is like I would bet my life on this. I would bet anything on
Yeah.
this. Like, like the 1 + 1 = 2 is a good example. Like that's a
Yeah.
pretty, even debate if we should have credence one, but that's going to be one of the best examples of that.
Yeah.
And then credence zero would be like the reverse of that. So like 1 + 1 = 3 could be
Yeah.
a good example of that.
Cool.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just very briefly then say like, okay, so we have belief, withholding, disbelief. We have credence, which is there's 3 here. There's like in principle like an infinite number of credences you could have. I mean, maybe we don't actually have an infinite number of credences, but it's a lot more fine-grained, a lot more kind of like specific. And it raises a bunch of interesting questions. And I get into a lot of these in my dissertation, but like, how do these attitudes relate to each other? Our beliefs, does one reduce to the other? Like, why would we have both of these? I mean,
Yeah.
like if we have both of these, I mean, some philosophers, it's not a popular view, but some philosophers would say like we actually don't have beliefs at all. We only have credences, or possibly vice versa. So I think there's this 2-part picture raises a bunch of interesting questions. But I think it also has like cool implications for like religious epistemology and some topics we're going to talk about.
Yeah, no, it definitely does, because this is also another area where I haven't landed the plane fully on like any specific view. So it's like, what's the relationship between beliefs and credences? Does the credence like inform the belief, and all this other stuff? So I'm more interested in just kind of hearing your views and like some of the arguments you have for these things.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say for sure, like I think the belief and credence are at least connected in certain ways.
Yeah.
The view I tend to lean towards is a view on which like they're independent in various ways, or at least like it's not like it's all credence or all belief. Like we have both attitudes. We're not just like reducing it to belief or reducing it all to credence. And they both have a role to play. And I think part of that too is saying like these 2 branches of epistemology, formal and traditional epistemology, also both have this like very legitimate role to play, and how like are rightfully called epistemology. So that's kind of part of why I think this is important, because it will tell us like, are these belief people just talking about nothing? Are these credence people talking about nothing? And I'm thinking, no, like both are talking about very legitimate things. Do we always have super fine-grained credences in like every single proposition? Like maybe not. Sometimes credences could be like fuzzy or imprecise or something, so some people worry about that. Like my credence that my neighbor has a can of tuna in their pantry, like maybe it's not like 0.843256, like right. So we don't have to say that in order to say like we in some sense have levels of confidence in things. Sometimes they're precise, like the coin example, right? It's not like that's a precise credence, and sometimes maybe they're fuzzy or imprecise, but we have levels of confidence and we have beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the way I kind of phrase that is just like I parse it out in terms of like epistemic probability and just say like, hey, I'm moderately confident in this proposition or something like that.
Yeah,
and I think we can kind of go
absolutely.
off of stuff like that. So
Yeah.
okay, so interesting. At what point then would you say like at what confidence level or credence level would you say something becomes a belief?
Yeah. Well, here's what's interesting. Like you might even just like question the presupposition of the question. Like, do things become a belief at a certain credence level?
Yeah.
And also like, can we like? It might even be that we like sometimes believe things without having formed a credence in them. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing things out there. I don't have strong views on this, but like Andrew Moon thinks that like sometimes children, or maybe like in the middle of the night when you're like fumbling around, you might form beliefs, but you might not actually have formed credences and like the things you're forming beliefs about. So again, I'm not necessarily defending this view, just sort of like throwing it out there. And I mean, if you did want to say like there was a level at which a credence, became something you believed, like there's different views. So like one view is like 0.5, like kind of a maybe basic view, but it does kind of seem like, well, I could have a credence like 0.51 in something, but still like withhold belief on it. Like let's take a coin that's like slightly weighted towards heads, so it's like 0.51, 0.49.
Yeah.
I'm still gonna withhold belief that it lands heads, even though it's slightly more likely.
Yeah.
So then some people will say, I mean, there is also the view that beliefs are credence one. The problem with that, though, is it seems like we believe things that we're not maximally confident in.
Yeah.
And so then like the third view would be that because it just seems kind of weird to just like throw a number out there, be like 0.82, like or whatever.
Well,
So
yeah,
some
I
people will
always get
say,
that with
yeah,
I always get that
yeah,
when I always get that when people ask me about, like, the credence I put in Christianity. I'm just like, I can't give you a number,
right,
but I'm fairly confident, like, given
yeah,
the data. So that's why
for sure.
like that's why I like to opt for that epistemic probability stuff until
Mm.
but yeah, anyway, continue.
Yeah. Well, no, I was just gonna say, like, another view is that there's not just a fixed threshold for credence, but it might vary with context. Like, it might be, a different threshold in different contexts. And like, you're right too. Like, it might not always be, a precise credence. That's another possibility. Is that there's not like a precise threshold, but it's some kind of like vague threshold or something. So
Yeah.
again, not everyone necessarily thinks believing is a matter of having certain credences. But if you did think there was that connection, that's probably, in my opinion, one of like the more plausible way to go rather than just like putting the threshold at 0.5 or at 1, because I think both of those run into some problems.
Yeah, exactly. Um,
Yeah.
and another question that somebody might ask at this point is like, okay, so when does a belief become rational? Like, what does it mean
Mm.
for a belief to be rational, and what does it mean for a belief to be rational? Is there even a middle ground between the two? Is there levels of rationality for beliefs?
Yeah.
Positions like that? I know I'm asking like really.
It's a hard question. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so maybe first I'll say like it's widely acknowledged among philosophers that there's different kinds of rationality. So
yeah.
we're not beliefs, and even beliefs can be rational in different senses. So beliefs could be practically rational, they could be epistemically rational, they could, I mean, maybe, I don't know if morally rational you would say, but maybe morally permissible or impermissible, possibly. So
Hmm.
we can look at beliefs from these different perspectives. And I'm just going to hone in on the epistemic one because I think that is kind of the one we're interested in. We're talking about epistemology,
Yeah,
and a lot of people think that's kind of like in some ways like the fundamental way we would evaluate beliefs. Like you can say like, oh, this belief is like practically beneficial or it like makes you happy, but like ultimately we want to have epistemically rational beliefs, at
yeah,
least a lot of us. So maybe kind of honing in on that. Well, what makes a belief epistemically rational? Okay, I'm just going to give like a general view is that it's closely connected to your evidence. Sorry,
yeah.
I just took a drink of water and I'm
It's okay.
like, so what makes a belief rational is that you have good evidence supporting the truth of that belief, right?
Hmm.
So it's rational for me to believe I ate eggs for breakfast this morning because I have a very clear and distinct memory of making eggs for breakfast. This was like 12 hours ago. So like
Yeah,
hopefully my memory serves. And that belief I had eggs for breakfast this morning is rational because of the evidence based on the memory. Um, let's say I really love unicorns, and because I really love unicorns, I just really want there to be like an invisible unicorn in the room with me right here. Right.
hmm,
Well, most of us would say even if you just like will yourself or desire yourself into like just really want this unicorn to be here, and you can make yourself believe it, that's not a rational belief because you just don't have evidence that there's an invisible unicorn in the room with you,
yeah,
right? So the general rule of thumb is that evidence is, kind of like the main thing that makes
yeah,
belief rational. That said, this is very simplified because
yeah.
I think
Exactly.
it's there's so many questions like what is evidence? What does it mean to have evidence? When is evidence sufficient for belief? And then also like, is it only evidence? Could things like practical stakes or moral factors play a role? Could
Yeah,
things like can I believe differently of my close friends and family than of distant strangers, even if I have the same evidence? So there's a bunch of questions that come in here. But I think
yep.
most epistemologists think, evidence is at least playing a fundamental role in determining rational belief, and rational beliefs are the ones that are based on evidence.
Yeah, it's such a weird topic because, like, one of the other things that I've been pondering lately, and just even in preparation for this, that I don't have an answer to, and I'm not
Mm,
expecting you to kind of go into this either, but it's just kind of like the intricacies of just what this debate, what this
Yeah.
topic is like, right? It's like, well, okay, I think I have good evidence for Christianity, so therefore I think I'm rational in it. But like somebody like Oppie, right? He might say, you
Mm,
know, you don't have good evidence for Christianity,
mm,
and so, but at the same time, somebody like Oppie's going to say something like, well, at least from what I've heard of him, right? He calls Christians rational and
yeah.
holding their beliefs, right? Um, so that almost seems like a counterexample it almost seems like a counterexample, but it's like really not, but it kind of is. So it's like it's such a weird topic.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to say is like, so there are some topics where I think our evidence like clearly points one way or another. So,
Mhm.
is the earth round or not? It's like, yeah, there are people that are flat earthers, but like, sorry, like they're irrational, or like at least
Yeah,
most of them are, and like they don't have good evidence supporting that view. But I think a lot of philosophers would say, like, on these kind of like deep fundamental philosophical questions about like morality and metaphysics and epistemology and like even theism, atheism, like there really is like they're hard questions. And why
yeah,
are they hard? Because there's actually good evidence on both sides. There's really interesting, good arguments for God's existence. Some people think religious experiences can justify religious belief. Planning thinks you don't need an argument. So there's these
yeah.
considerations on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it's like the problem of evil is hard. And as a Christian, like I think it's okay to say that the problem of hiddenness is
Yeah.
hard. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm not one of those Christians that's going to say there's zero evidence for atheism. I actually don't think that's really a productive way to move forward and acknowledge
Mhm.
like people have been debating on this for like forever. And
Yeah.
like I also think too, like on a lot of these issues, people can be rational on both sides. Like, what if pro-lifers and pro-choicers were like, yeah, like I mean, I'm very adamantly whatever, but like people on the other side, they're rational too, and there's good arguments for that side too. I mean,
Oh,
I
people get
actually
mad
think
at
it
me
would
for that
be
all the time.
yeah, and not to bring up a too controversial example, but I just feel like our dialogue would be so much better if we were willing to acknowledge like
Yes.
evidence can be complicated, hard to evaluate. We can take different perspectives on the evidence, and because
Yeah.
of that, people can be aware of very similar evidence, but both be rational. And also, sometimes we don't even have the same evidence. Like a lot of theists have religious experiences that
Yep.
atheists don't. So
Oh,
that's
yeah.
worth
No,
thinking about too.
I'm very upfront with atheists that like one of the strongest pieces of evidence that I have internal to myself for Christianity is that I don't talk about this like too often, but like I had a Christophany. At least I think
Mm,
I did, right?
mm,
An experience where I think Christ actually appeared to me. That's like very and
yeah.
I've scrutinized it like as much as I possibly could just to try to be as objective as I can. But that's very strong evidence for Christianity to me. So it's like I
Yeah.
I I'm rational in my own like rights, right? And believing in Christianity. I think just in virtue of that. Um, and it's just so interesting to me because I completely agree with what you're saying because one of the ways I like to parse out rationality is like I think one of the conditions of it might just be to be like consistent with the propositions you believe as well.
Mm, yeah.
Um, and that's why I think, for instance, like it, on that pro-life, pro-choice debate, I think there's people whose axiology might just be a little bit different on
Mm,
both sides, but it's consistent on both sides
mm.
internally, and that's why I think they're rational and the disagreement that they're having. If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. I mean, we don't need to get into it here, but yeah, I
Yeah,
think the coherence thing is really interesting. Because sometimes actually the coherent stuff and the evidence stuff, there's nerdy epistemology about
yeah,
like, do these always fit together? And like
yeah,
if you're a coherentist, can you also be an evidentialist? Or what if your evidence seems to support incoherent, anyways. So, but yeah,
yeah,
no, I think coherence is clearly important. And in most cases,
yeah,
knowingly having incoherent beliefs is seems seems kind of
yeah,
irrational.
yeah,
But yeah, like I feel like part of this is just like saying like, look, I have this set of coherent beliefs, they have this set. They just have a different perspective on things.
yeah,
And we can both kind of like have our worldviews and both be rational. That doesn't mean we're both right. This isn't a
yeah,
relativism about truth. It's important to kind of flag
yeah.
that, but we can both be
Whenever I
rational.
talk about this with my students, one of the things that I always bring up is there's always those like meme videos and like
Mm.
pictures and the sound effects. It's like, hey, did you hear do you see the blue dress or do you see the gold dress? Do you remember that thing?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
that one was wild. Yeah.
Right. But then
Yeah.
so, like there's the one with the name. I forgot what the name was.
Mm.
But like some people heard a different one name, some people heard a
Oh
different name.
yeah,
I forgot
I
what it
think I
was
heard.
though.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Um And like the people are rational in believing whatever they're seeing and whatever they're hearing, even
Yeah.
though they're disagreeing, right? So it seems like there's something a little bit deeper going on. So that's always one of my favorite examples.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so just so we don't get too much into the weeds here, is there
Yeah.
anything else you want to talk about on that kind of stuff before we kind of dig into like philosophy of faith stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty solid sort of background on like some general epistemology stuff. And if we need to like jump back into anything,
Yeah,
we can. But I say let's go talk
cool.
about faith. Yeah.
Okay, somebody in the comments brought it, told us what it is. It's the Laurel and Yanni thing.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep. That one was that's
That's
weird. Yeah.
crazy. My
Yeah.
my wife has a friend named Laurel, and whenever she brings her
Oh
up, I'm like, "Wait, is it Yanni though?"
yeah. Nice.
Okay,
Yeah.
so philosophy of faith. This is actually a really fun topic, especially just because I made a video recently, just making some exegetical arguments for why faith is not what some internet like not like anti-Christians and anti-religious people might call
Dang. I
faith
wish
with
I would
faith
have
without
watched that
evidence.
before this. That sounds really cool. Anyway, I'm gonna put it on my to watch list. Keep going.
Fair
Sorry.
enough. No, you're totally good.
Yeah.
The long story short is like I covered the doubting Thomas passage because people like to
Oh,
point to
nice.
that, and like when Jesus says like, "Oh, blessed be those who believe haven't seen" thing, and then the Hebrews verse faces evidence of things not seen.
Yep.
I'm,
Yep.
I'm really dorky with theology and exegetical arguments, so
That's great though.
um,
We need that. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway,
So
yeah.
so it's a really fun topic because I just talked about this, like arguing that like biblical faith is just it's um it's believing in the like unseen promises of God, trusting in God to bring about his redemptive plan, all this other stuff. It's not like a propositional thing. It's like
Mm.
it's a believing loyalty thing,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, interesting.
So I think this is a really fun topic just in light of the fact that like this just came out recently too. So what
Cool.
is the philosophy of faith? Like some people might even just be like, wait, there's a philosophy of faith? Like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what is it?
It's a again a big topic, so I don't want to be like I'm going to
Yeah,
tell you
yeah.
everything you need to know about it, but I will say not to try to plug too much of my own stuff, but I did just write the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the philosophy of faith. And so if you're like wanting more, there's like way, 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 way more stuff there and a bunch of citations. So people can check that out. But I guess briefly, I mean, it's different philosophical questions about faith. So maybe the first most obvious one is what is faith? That's a really big question. And then another one would be how does faith relate to kind of these other states or attitudes that seem, similar, like belief and hope and different things like that. And then I think the third big question would be how should we evaluate faith? So, could faith be epistemically rational, practically rational, morally good? Is it always one or the other? So,
Yeah.
that's like in broad strokes, I guess, kind of at least some of the big questions in philosophy of faith, not all
Yeah.
of them. And maybe it's like worth saying like two things about it before we jump into other stuff. And the first is faith isn't just a religious thing. So some people, I think, especially on YouTube, think faith just means like believing in a religion or belief in God
Yeah.
or something. But that's actually not how I think about it, not how most philosophers think about it. I actually think faith, what it is more fundamentally, is it's an attitude that's associated with our commitments.
Yeah.
So that can be a religious commitment, a commitment to God, but it can also be a ton of other things, like a commitment to a spouse or significant other, a commitment to a close friend, a commitment to yourself. Maybe you're like, I really want to get in shape. I really want to learn to play guitar. I really want to, finish this
Yeah.
degree, whatever it is. I think faith plays a really important role in helping us keep our commitments over time because as you know, thinking about a lot of these things like getting in shape or like actually becoming really good at guitar when you've never played an instrument before, those things are
Yeah.
hard. Like it's not like this just like walk in the park. You have to like even if you're really excited about it at first, you have to really like have like grit to like keep going even if you're like
Yeah.
doubting
I
yourself or
feel
doubting.
that.
Yeah. So I think faith fundamentally is an attitude that kind of helps us keep our commitments. So
Mhm.
that's actually kind of goes into the definition of faith too. Did you want to
Yeah.
comment on that? Yeah.
No, that falls right in line with like what I argue in that video too, where I call
Oh,
faith
cool.
like a believing loyalty, right?
Mm,
And within the context of like the Bible, right, in the Christian faith. So, no,
absolutely.
I like that a lot, and I really like the example you even brought up with like that kind of disposition you might have or that attitude that you might have for yourself too.
Mm.
I'm feeling that just in general with like life circumstances that we just
Yeah.
talked about. I'm also at the moment trying to learn Ugaritic.
Oh,
so
wow.
so
Yeah, you need a lot of faith for that one. Yeah, no.
so
Wow.
it's
Yeah,
really hard. So
totally.
yeah, I resonated with that. That's a really helpful example that you gave. Okay, so
Yeah.
there's all these different parts of like the philosophy of faith. What would be like the most? What are like some of the important parts that some of the viewers might take away from here, on just some of your views and how that affects like that relationship between epistemology and faith and all that stuff?
For sure. So maybe I'll say two things, but we can talk more. So maybe the first, I kind of already touched on what is faith a little bit, but I actually have
Yeah.
a really specific, I think, like it's a four-part definition of faith. And I think at least for me, thinking about it, I think it's helpful to kind of lay it
Hmm.
out there. So what is faith? Well, faith has four components. The first is a belief like component. So this can be a belief, but like we were talking about, it could be like a high confidence or a high credence, or it could be thinking the thing is more likely than not, or
Hmm.
these various belief like states. So if you think like something is impossible or astronomically unlikely, I think you probably can't have faith. You need some kind of belief like or confidence like attitude. So that's the first.
Yeah.
The second is faith actually also involves a desire like attitude. So when we say like, I have faith you're gonna like win your basketball game tonight, but I'm cheering for the other team. That doesn't really
Yeah.
make sense. Like
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Or like, I have faith that. Trying to think of an example, another example, like I have faith in my marriage, but like I really hope my marriage collapses and like ends in divorce. You're right, like
Yeah.
that just doesn't make
That seems
sense.
weird.
It's
Yeah.
totally. And so I think a lot of people think, at least on some level, faith requires a desire for the object of faith. So belief like, desire like. The third is what we were just talking about. Faith involves a commitment. Like I was
Hmm.
saying, don't need to get into that necessarily a ton again, but faith underlies a lot of our commitments. And I think even like faith that a chair will hold me, there is a commitment there. Maybe it's
Yeah.
like a not super important commitment, or it's not
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
nearly as important. Like if this chair broke, I would buy a new chair and it wouldn't be the end of the world.
Yeah.
But I still think there's some kind of commitment there. But like the more fundamental the commitment is, the more important the faith is. And then I also think faith is resilient. So what that means, it's related to the commitment thing, but it basically means faith keeps us going in light of
Yeah.
obstacles. So whether that's counter evidence, whether that's questioning like if you desire the thing anymore, whether that's you just aren't feeling it, whatever
Yeah.
it is, faith helps keep us going in these commitments even in light of obstacles. So that's like my view of what faith is.
Hmm.
And then maybe I'll just say one more thing about the rationality of faith, but we can dive, like that's a huge question, so we
Yeah.
can dive more into that if you want. But about the rationality of faith, one mistake I think a lot of Christians make is to try to say something like faith is always rational no matter what, or something like that.
Hmm.
And I actually just don't think that's correct. One, because faith is this big thing that doesn't just involve religion, but it can involve tons of attitudes and commitments we have all the time. So like if I call an Uber and like 12 hours later I'm still like waiting there for my Uber because I like have faith the driver is going to show up, like that's not rational faith.
Yeah.
um Maybe a big interesting question related to the religious commitment thing, like could faith in God ever be irrational? I don't know. That's an interesting question to think
Yeah.
about. But my view is definitely not that all faith is always rational no matter what. It's also not the view that all faith is always irrational no matter what. And I think people do give that view, like atheists on Twitter or
Yeah.
whatever. But I think that what's going on there is they're actually working with a different definition of faith than most philosophers.
Yeah.
So at least if we're like kind of being clear about what our terms mean, maybe we could use the word trust if they don't like the word faith, or whatever.
Yeah.
Just throw a different term in there. I think like it's just not going to be the case that faith is always
Yeah.
irrational. So
Yeah.
sometimes
No.
rational, sometimes irrational.
No, I really resonate with that. I like, and all, like I said, all those components that you kind of brought up is fits pretty neatly with like the exegetical things that I put out too. Um,
Awesome.
the one of the things that's interesting to me on the topic of the definition of faith before we get into the rationality of faith, um, it's always, this is one of those things that I've been pondering for quite some time, and I think where I'm at with it is like was talking with Joe Schmidt about this at one
Mm,
point. Because he brought up the fact that like, hey, he doesn't know how non-belief in the proposition Christianity is true, for instance, could have like moral significance.
mm.
Depending on like your views on doxastic realism, not realism.
Voluntarism?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Doxastic
yeah.
voluntarism, involuntarism, all that stuff, right? Um, and so just like assuming involuntarism or like maybe even an indirect
Mhm.
voluntarism, it the kind of where I've landed the plane right now is like maybe there isn't like a moral significance to your doxastic attitude to these things, depending on how you
Mm,
parse out the evidence. Um, but the moral claim is like if you do believe in it, um, then perhaps there is like a moral significance to what you do after you have that belief. If that
yeah,
makes sense. I
yeah.
don't know where you land the plane there, but like I always think that's a really fascinating question.
Yeah. Well, it's related to actually some recent stuff in epistemology that's not even actually about religion,
Hmm.
but there's been kind of this like big thing in epistemology lately that's called doxastic wronging. So the idea is that beliefs, so a lot of people again have focused on like the epistemic rationality beliefs, like when, like what is evidence, like when are beliefs rational based on evidence, like da 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 da, belief evidence, that kind of stuff. But like this like thing has emerged, which is like, well, what if beliefs can like morally wrong people? That would be really interesting. And they're thinking about like forming beliefs about your spouse. Like one example in the literature is like your spouse comes home from like a dinner or something, and your spouse is, let's say, a recovering alcoholic, and so they're
Hmm.
like they've been sober for like 6 months, let's say, and they have like a wine stain on their shirt. So the thought is, well, unless you have like if that's all the evidence you have that like the wine stain on their shirt, and you form the belief that they've started drinking again based on that, even if you don't act on that belief itself actually still wrongs the
Yeah.
person. So that's just an example, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know what I think about religious beliefs in doxastic wronging, or even doxastic wronging, but then there's also like, could they be morally good? That would be like the
Yeah.
positive. That's like but like it is interesting to think about how this has been a big thing in like general epistemologies, like looking at the morality of belief.
Yeah.
Maybe that would have implications here. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, I didn't even know about doxastic running. So that's good.
Mm.
That's a rabbit hole to get into now.
Yeah,
Uh,
we don't need to get into it. I just
no,
thought
no,
like
no.
it had, but
Well,
like I like, yeah. I was gonna say
I
too,
don't even
I
know
like
anything
your,
about it.
yeah, I like your point about it not like you can locate it in other things too, like in the action or in the consequences of the belief or something. So and I think
Yeah,
that's a really important point that should be made. So
yeah.
I agree with that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we why am I drawing a blank now?
No, you're good.
We just okay, so we talked about what faith is. We talked a little about like morality of faith. Now it's the rationality of faith. That's what we're gonna do.
Cool.
So yeah, like what's the difference between like rational faith and irrational faith?
Yeah, this is a huge topic, and again, obviously, I'm not gonna be able to fully do it
Yeah, yeah.
justice here, but maybe there's a couple things worth saying. So I think the first thing worth saying is that faith that just ignores all the evidence is almost never going to be rational. So
Mhm.
again, my view isn't that faith is always rational, but one reason this is kind of like I think an especially interesting question is because a lot of people think, well, we talked about how faith is resilient. So faith kind of helps us continue in our commitments even in light of obstacles. And one of the
Mhm.
biggest obstacles that we often get is counter evidence. Like think about a religious commitment. You make a commitment, let's say you're a Christian, read the Bible, go to church, you pray, and maybe you start like, I mean, you don't have to get into it by reading philosophy. Reading philosophy would be one way, but you could even just
Yeah.
like watch the news and be like, dang, like there's some
Dang.
really crappy stuff
Yeah.
going on in the world.
Yeah.
Like, like name there's a thousand things I could name,
Yeah.
pandemics and tsunamis and whatever, but like this sucks. Like, why would God allow this stuff? Or it might even be something like in your own life you experience like a really
Mhm.
hardship, trial, that kind of thing. And so faith is supposed to kind of function to help us continue in our commitments, even in light of, at least some level of counter evidence. But then it's like, how could that ever be rational if faith is like going against the evidence, or how do we want to characterize that? And I think the way I often will characterize it is going beyond the evidence, at least in some sense, but not going against the evidence. I think going against the evidence is where I draw the line. But I think there's a couple ways that faith can go beyond the evidence and still be rational. I don't know which one to talk about because I have a lot of thoughts. But okay, maybe I'll say one that actually is about belief and credence, because we talked about that earlier. So one thing just on belief and credence that's worth noting is that evidence can move our credences around, but not always change our beliefs. So check the forecast. There's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. So I believe and have a 0.9 credence it's going to rain tomorrow. And then it changes to 85. So I changed my credence, but I still believe. And maybe it changes to 40%. I don't believe anymore, But like my credence can move, like how low. That kind of relates to the question we were talking about earlier, where maybe it's context dependent, or maybe it's we don't necessarily have to commit to a specific theory there, but my credence can move around like quite a bit, like maybe even get kind of close to 0.5. And it might still be rational for me to continue to believe the thing in question. Depending on the circumstance. And so it's not to say that faith just is belief. That's not my view, because I think faith involves those four components, but faith might function kind of like belief in this case. So the belief kind of can remain steadfast even as the credence is moving around. And I think that could be similar with faith. Like your credence that God exists might be like 0.95 or like really high, and then it might drop down to 0.8, and then it might go up to 0.9, and then it might drop down to 0.7. And I actually think like that's okay.
That's a normal Christian life.
Like I feel like, and this is another soapbox I could get on, and I'll try not to, but basically, like, I feel like people overvalue certainty. I don't think certainty is just like the only goal that we should have as Christians, and I think it's kind of overrated too.
When I teach, I always tell people that. I always tell people, get rid of certainty. Stop acting like you're certain all the time. Don't search for certainty. Look for probability.
For sure.
That's what I teach, at least, especially when it comes to like resurrection of Jesus stuff, gospel reliability, also, like things like that. So I think
that. I mean, related to that too is like, what I think God wants more than our certainty is our commitment, and that's like faith underlies our commitments and helps us continue in that commitment, even if we don't always have certainty or even close to certainty. And I think that's okay. So I think we should feel free to, like, the other problem too is if you overvalue certainty, you're going to feel like you have to dismiss or ignore evidence. And we were talking about this earlier, how like people on both sides will say like there's no evidence for that or there's no evidence for that side. But like if you think like you have to be certain, that you're going to naturally lead to that, because you're going to say, well, if I admit there's like the problem of evil is evidence against Christianity, I'm not going to be certain anymore because there's at least some evidence, and you're going to get all screwed up. So I think overvaluing certainty is problematic for a lot of reasons. But I think this idea that your credences, or you could talk about it as an epistemic probability too, like there is fluctuation there, but your belief is steadfast, and I think similarly your faith can be steadfast. So that's one way. I'm happy to talk about more. Or I don't know. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about.
I really like what you're saying there too. I also really resonate with that. Because I became a Christian at the age of like 23-ish. I was an atheist most of my life, and after I became a Christian, I ran into just like the people that were like kind of teaching me at the time were really dogmatic about certain beliefs that I just could not hold to. And so that sent me into like this huge crisis where I was just like, I just realigned my whole entire life to become a Christian, and I'm only a year in, and now I'm like, what the heck is happening? Right. Yeah. And at that point I went through like this huge deconstruction, but the deconstruction was the kind where I was like, God, look, I still believe you're there right now. It's just like, I have a really hard time believing. I'm going to look at all this stuff. I'm going to look at the evidence, and I'm just trusting you to get me through the other side. Cool. And my credence was like, went from all the way up here, all the way down there, back to all the way up here. That. So I just really resonate with what you're saying there.
That's cool.
One of the questions I do have, kind of going backwards a little bit, is you made a distinction between going beyond the evidence and going against the evidence. Can you help me understand that?
For sure. So, when you think about, we can just talk about it in terms of credence fluctuations, but there's other ways to talk about it too, I think. But like one way to think about it is like your credence could maybe go all over the interval from 0.5 to 1. Like, you know, could get really close to 0.5, could get really close to 1, could go all over that interval. You know, maybe lower than 0.5. I don't know. That's much more controversial, but at least over that interval. But if your credence in Christianity, like, let's say your evidence is like 0.0000001 that Christianity is true or that God exists, I mean, at the very least, it's very hard to make sense of the idea that your belief could be epistemically rational. It could be practically rational. You could maybe accept or act as if that God exists. So I don't want to necessarily be like exclusive here and saying like you're kicked out, but like you're like, if your evidence is really that I mean, there's also a question of like, how do you get to the point where evidence is really that weak, and are you actually like, are you right about your evidence? You know, I mean, there's a lot of questions I would ask this person. But like, if you're like, you're not, I'm not saying like believe something even though your evidence is like 99.999% sure atheism is true, you know. So that's the sense in which I don't think like there's this view called fideism, which is the view that like faith is irrational, but that's like a good thing. That's like a feature, not a bug. And that's not the view I want to hold. So I don't want to say like, just like ignore the evidence and believe whatever you want. And then like, just like, you know, like the evidence doesn't matter. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. And actually what's really cool about belief and credence is that we have like the belief or the faith that's like this steadfast thing, and the credence is actually tracking our evidence. So like, we don't, not only do we not ignore the evidence, we actually have a credence to track where our evidence is at. Like, I think that's one of the main functions of credence. And then like, we're not ignoring evidence at all. In fact, we're like tightly tracking as our evidence like fluctuates. So and not am I, I'm actually like kind of saying the opposite. Like, not only should you not ignore the evidence, you should like track it very carefully, think about it very carefully, and adjust your credence accordingly.
I'm wondering, this is really off the weeds, so we don't have to get in. This is going to be a really deep in the weeds question, so we don't have to get into it. So just like a simple yes or no even might be fine here. But I'm wondering if there is a connection with this concept and just what we find in like philosophy of science, with the debate between like Popper's falsificationism and like the De Quine thesis and conformational holism and stuff like that. Like, so like, for example, right, let's just say I am a Christian, but let's just say I come across some evidence that at least like prima facie might make me think like, oh, this is like really bad. Like, if this evidence is as strong as it seems at first glance against Christianity, it would actually like make me not be a Christian anymore. Could you still be rational in saying something along the lines of like this? Like, all the evidence I've come across so far and the objections I've come across so far to Christianity, I've been there's been ways that have I've been able to show myself or other people that these evidential chips in the past don't actually overturn Christianity. In fact, there's been times where it's either nullified evidence or has hurt it just only a little bit, or in fact has actually like helped Christianity, whatever, right? Are you rational? So the whole point is like, are you rational in just being like, look, there's a track record here, and that steadfastness of my faith in combination with that makes me say, okay, look, I can pause that evidence here, still maintain rationality and my belief, and I don't have to like lose my faith because I've run across this like really difficult evidential chip, whatever it might be, right? We could even like, let's just say we find an ossuary and it says here lies Jesus of Nazareth, right?
Right. I was going to use that example actually.
Yeah, right. Like, let's just say we found that, and like and then we found that tomorrow, and that's like my line of reasoning. I'm like, I'm gonna wait before I like come to something. Like, do you get what I'm trying to get after here? Is that rational?
For sure. Or yeah, I mean, I think it can be for sure. I mean, it can depend on the exact details, but like one thing to note is if you get evidence but realize like more evidence is forthcoming or it's not like quite conclusive yet, like, yeah, maybe go ahead and like adjust your credence to an extent, but like a lot of times we're going to kind of hold off on like giving up a commitment until we kind of have like figured out how everything fits together. I mean, another thing to think about too is like this person presumably they have really strong evidence in favor of theism or in favor of Christianity. And so then you have to like think about that too. Like you're not
Yeah.
only giving weight to that one new piece of evidence, you're also going to have to consider the old evidence that you have as well, and sort of adjust your beliefs and credences on the basis of all of that. And so yeah, like I think if someone like claimed to find the body of Jesus, or like there's like news articles popping up, like, you know, like I would say like, well, at first you should definitely hold off and kind of like wait and see,
Yeah.
like, okay, how are people responding to this? Like, what are the main views on this? Do we have actually a reason to think this is actually the body of Jesus, you know? And then, you know, I mean, go from there. Like, if like, I just can't foresee this happening, but it, you know, if it got to the point where it was like proved beyond a shadow of a doubt this is the body of Jesus, yeah, we would really have to rethink things as Christians.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't want to, I feel like it would be dishonest to say otherwise, you know, like if you say like there's no way that this view I have could be falsified, like that's a problem too, you know. But I just think like, you know, it would take a lot to get there. And I guess it's also worth noting too, like it doesn't mean we should be atheists, right?
Yeah.
Like like maybe we would want to rethink very key important parts of Christianity, but like we don't have to just like go all the way to atheism there either. So
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe one of the councils was wrong.
Right.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. Okay, so we talked a little bit about faith, and we kind of actually did get into like the relationship between faith and epistemology at this point too, just because we're like looking at this stuff. Is there anything else you kind of wanted to bring up or talk about? And like we covered a lot today, and we didn't go too far in depth in a lot of these things. But this was kind of like what I wanted to go for anyway. It's just like an introductory topic to these really weird topics.
So, I think we hit like a lot of the really big stuff. I mean, there is still, I have other thoughts on like ways faith might go beyond the evidence, but still be rational. And, you know, and another topic is like the relationship between faith and knowledge. But like, you know, we've hit like the core of my views, and I don't know if are we gonna do like questions.
I have some questions. Stuff? I have some questions saved up if you have time for a Q&A.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. I should like go like way past 9, but like I could probably go like 5-10 minutes past. So
cool.
So yeah,
I don't think it'll that. Well, we're at the 54-minute mark. Oh, it's 3 minutes till 9.
It's okay. Cool. I mean, it's flexible, but yeah, like maybe like 1:10ish.
Yeah.
You know, cool. Flexible, but like, yeah, I have a kid who can wake up as early as 5 a.m. So you understand.
I totally get it. Okay. So first, just Nick's Highlander. Thank you for that super chat. Really appreciate it, my brother. All right. John asks, do you believe anyone, God, humans, angels, can be certain of some proposition like torturing babies for fun is wrong, I exist, etc., and why?
Can be, yes, for sure. Okay. I mean, I think God is certain of every, if not almost every proposition. I mean, you know, certain is true or certain it's false. You know, there's this debate about open theism, like, are there certain future propositions, you know, whatever. But like, God has certainty on pretty much everything God believes. You know, everything God believes. Right. Angels, that's a good question. That's probably that's not my cup of tea because I don't have the theology of that, but interesting question for sure. Would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. But like humans, I think can be certain. So they can have the attitude of certainty towards like 1 + 1 = 2 in the sense that like, it's like they couldn't be more sure of it. Then the huge question that's like way more controversial is, could that ever be rational? So should you be 100% certain in this, you know, very, very high, like Credence 1 sense, that 1 + 1 = 2. And like you know, this is the Descartes thing. So people are familiar with that, but it's like, what if there's a demon deceiving us about math and logic, you know? And so it's like, one of Descartes' big things is like pretty much everything you can kind of bring into at least a little bit of doubt. And then Descartes says like, I think, therefore I am. But then people have said, well, what if there is no self? Like, just because you think doesn't mean that there's a self, you know, whatever. So people even question the I think, therefore I am thing. So there is a view in epistemology that I think a decent number of people hold, which is that even if you can be certain of something, it's not of something. It's not rational to be certain of anything. But then so people disagree about that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the ways I kind of cash it out too when it comes to God, for instance, is just like I like to cash it out in terms like direct awareness. I think just
Yeah.
God can be certain about a lot of different things just through direct awareness. And on the open theism topic, I mean, depending on your metaphysics, and how you view time and truth makers and all that stuff, right? Like, if
Yeah.
open theism is true, not getting in all the weeds and stuff like that, like, I don't think really presents too many issues. I just, depending on your model of God, I just think there's so many models of God that
Yeah.
this question is just so interesting. So,
It
okay,
is. It's a great question.
okay, another cute. What do you make of primitivists and knowledge first approaches like Williamson?
Yeah, good question. So we didn't totally get into this, but when you kind of look at, I guess, like the history of epistemology, especially in the last like 100 years or so, like there's this big question of like how do we define knowledge? We didn't really talk about it, but
Yeah,
a lot of people for a long time had this like knowledge is justified true belief definition. Gettier came in, gave what a lot of people think is like a convincing counterexample, cases of justified true belief without knowledge. I'm not going to get into all of this here, but I have videos on
mhm,
my channel about it if people want
yep,
to check those out. And so then people said, okay, it's not, knowledge isn't just justified true belief. So how can we like add to that to like get knowledge? And then there's all these attempts, and like a lot of people think most of the attempts failed. And so then Williamson is like, hey, look, maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way. You're trying to define knowledge in terms of belief. What if we like treat knowledge as the primitive thing and then understand other things in epistemology in terms of knowledge? And it is true that knowledge is like one of the most common words, not only in English, but I think in pretty much every language. Like saying I know, he knows, she knows, whatever, like very common thing we utter all the time. And so Williamson is basically like, let's have knowledge be the first. Let's have knowledge be like the fundamental thing. I would not say I'm a knowledge firster, partially because I think even if we can't give a full-blown definition of knowledge, I still think we can give like necessary conditions for knowledge. And Williamson acknowledges this too. He's like, yeah, like justification, truth, and belief are necessary for knowledge. The view is, it's a little hard to get your mind around, and a lot
yeah,
of people that are experts on Williamson even admit this, because it's like Williamson acknowledges these are necessary conditions, and maybe he's like, but look, we still can't give a full definition. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, we can't give a full definition, true, but we can still make progress on it. So
yeah.
so I'm not convinced of knowledge first, but I think it's an important approach. It's an extremely influential approach. Big topic in epistemology now. So it's a very, I guess, popular and important view to know about.
Cool. All right. Let me explain. Asks, going back to that 1+1=2 example, would you say
Mhm.
that math is invented or discovered? I'm going to interpret that as, are you a mathematical realist or
Yeah.
not?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I'm just going to say, like, not my area of expertise. So I don't want to come in here and say, like, I know all the literature and whatever, but
Yeah.
like, I tend towards the view that it's discovered. I think there are mathematical truths that are true that we don't currently know about or have proofs for. And so I would say math is discovered. Like, one view that's kind of interesting is that math is something about like the structure of God's mind or something. So math describes like God's thoughts or the way God thinks or something. But I don't have firm views
Yeah.
on that either. But I would lean towards discovered.
Cool. All right. I'm gonna Kevin. I'm so sorry. Every single time I try to pronounce this made up last name that you have, I always mess it up. But I'm gonna try again. Kevin non-tradic. Wait, I almost had it. Kevin non-tradikith. So, Dr. Liz, do you not differentiate between religious faith versus non-religious faith?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is actually, if you look at the Internet Encyclopedia, a philosophy article, one of the distinctions I talk about, religious versus non-religious. And yeah, I think maybe, I mean, I don't know if I said something that made it seem like I don't make that distinction, but I think the point I was trying to make earlier is that they're both types of faith and very legitimate types of faith. Maybe there's a question of whether we should evaluate them the same way or treat them the same way. And some people have argued, and I'm not unsympathetic to this, but that like maybe scripture would tell us more about religious faith than about non-religious faith, and that we shouldn't just only use the tools of philosophy to give be able to say like, here's a full complete understanding of religious faith. And I think I would agree with that. We need to look at scripture, and the video you were mentioning before, Dan, is a great example of that. We look at scripture, but we can also use the tools of philosophy as well. So I'm definitely
Yep.
a both and person here.
Both.
Yeah.
I don't
For
think you
sure.
can do systematic theology without philosophy.
Mm.
Cool. Send me the link to that to the SCP article, and I'll
Yeah.
put it in the description. Your YouTube channel is already plugged too, so
Oh, cool.
um,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Please go follow her. If you don't, I'll cancel YouTube channel, my YouTube channel. I don't know. Okay. 2 more questions we got. John again asks, are there stance independent facts of the matter about what we ought to believe? P.S. Since you're a hooper, who do you think will win the NBA finals next year, and why the Suns?
I like that. Yeah, I've like kind of adopted the Raptors as my kind of team because I'm from Kansas. There's not really a team there. I knew some people that were like Thunder fans, but I never really got on the Thunder bandwagon or whatever. Even not really a bandwagon, but a bandwagon for people in Kansas. So anyway, I'm kind of going the Toronto route. So I'll say that I haven't been following as closely though, so that might be a totally out there prediction, but anyway, the Suns are cool too. I'm not anti the Suns for sure. Are there stance independent facts about what we ought to? So I guess yes. I think it depends on what you mean by stance independent. Because in one sense, there's the epistemic question, the practical question, possibly the moral question, looking at rational belief from all these perspectives. And so what I would say there is, well, I actually think these perspectives can kind of come together and form some kind of all things considered ought. So this is very controversial. Not everyone would agree with this, but I actually think practical, moral, and epistemic considerations can be weighed against each other. I don't always have the perfect theory for how we should give each one of them weight, but I think there are cases where maybe the epistemic should override some of the other ones, and other, you're just engaging in wishful thinking. Well, you should follow your evidence and not just like believe there's the pink unicorn there.
Yeah.
But if someone says like, I'm going to murder your entire family unless you take a pill that's going to give you like a random false belief, like I'm going to take the pill. In that case, like the moral one overrides the epistemic one. So if that's what you mean by stance independent, then I would say there is an all things considered ought for the question of what should we believe that takes all of these different domains, I guess, of normativity as inputs. But I'm not 100% sure if that's what you mean or not. But hopefully that is helpful.
All right. Last question. Oh, gosh. I read the question. Is epistemology prior to metaphysics or metaphysics prior to epistemology?
This is a complete cop-out, but like, it depends on what you mean by prior to. I mean, that sounds like a cop-out, but like, I guess, like, if you're saying like, I want to do the Descartes thing, and like, I want to like try to build my knowledge from the ground up, like, I feel like in some sense you're going to start with epistemology there, right? But if we're like, so like, almost like if you're taking like the first person perspective, like, epistemology is where you're going to start. But if you're kind of like taking like a third person perspective and like saying like, what is the world like? Like, what does it mean to exist, and what things exist, and what properties do they have, and do we have free will, and does God exist, and all of that? Like,
yeah.
Then I think metaphysics would be like the fundamental thing, and then we could build up to like questions about the nature of knowledge and like the extent to which humans like have access to reality. So that's I know super unsatisfying answer, but like both in a way, just depending on what your like your perspective, exactly.
No, that's kind of my answer to that too. That's why when I read the question before I pulled it up, I'm like, oh gosh.
Yeah. But let me say too, you can be an epistemologist and not think that epistemology is the most fundamental thing, and still think that epistemology is like a really important thing that we should study, in the same way that like physics is probably more fundamental than biology, but biology is still a very legitimate course of study, and we need biologists. So I don't think that just because I'm an epistemologist, I have to say like epistemology is prior. So I'll throw that out there too.
Fair enough. All right, that's all we got, Liz.
Cool.
I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you coming on here and just kind of explaining all these things. This was super fun.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Do you have anything else? Do you have anything else you want to say before we kind of sign off? Or
just stop being obsessed with certainty, especially Christians. I feel like I've already said that, but like
No, I love it.
I want to like emphasize that because I think it's a big problem in the church, that people are really obsessed with certainty, and think about commitment instead. Commitment is more important. So
No,
that's my final closing thought.
Awesome. Thank you everybody for coming to hang out today. Thanks for the questions and listening. Until next time, God bless.